Hello, hello, and thank you for joining us for the very first of our Healing Illinois Heritage series. We will be talking about a different honorary of different heritage months as we go throughout the year, the first six of which are being sponsored by the Healing Illinois grants. I just said, for those of you watching this as a recording, that I would try not to speak too fast and have already stumbled over my words 17 times, but we got this. So for those of you who may or may not know, and that is all good, January is Poverty Awareness Month. And so that is why we have poverty as the focus for our first session. As it was just MLK Day on Monday, I wanted to begin with an MLK quote that is not one that I've seen very many public places. As you know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood against three things of racism, materialism, and war. And he said, and I quote, "I must remind you that starving a child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and her child is violence. Discrimination against a working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical needs is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence." So kind of grounding us in why this is an important conversation and why it very much ties into the YWCA mission of eliminating racism and empowering women. And if folks do have to, I'm seeing in the chat, have to drop off the call, no worries at all. As I shared, this is being recording. I believe I hit record, so if not, I'll just do it again. So please, again, feel free to participate in the chat. And for folks watching in the future, always reach out by email with questions or anything you'd like to add or see in future presentations. For today, we'll be talking a little bit about what is poverty, defining it as from an American governmental perspective, talk a bit about who is affected, dive into and debunk some myths about poverty, and then I'll be talking about how we moralize, racialize, and politicize poverty. So we're going to go a little deep into more so than just definitions, some of the connotations and some of the socio-political discourse around what poverty is. So what does it feel like? How do we talk about it? How do we talk about people who experience it? I have a little bit of language guidance and then ending on things that you might be able to do in your community. We have a couple of fantastic nonprofit partners on the call, so I may be asking the group ways that folks can volunteer and get involved. So what is poverty? There are actually two different versions or definitions of the federal poverty measure, which is the poverty threshold and poverty guidelines. So I did a lot of learning on this too, so if this is new language for you, no worries, we're going to go into it. Poverty thresholds are defined by the U.S. Census Bureau mainly for statistical purposes, and it prepares estimates for the number of Americans in poverty each year. So whenever you see a U.S. Census report, a lot of grant funding will have have poverty threshold measures. And so it's kind of more high-level statistical governmental reports on poverty. Typically, what we do for those of you who work in social service industry, nonprofits, or just kind of follow maybe the news more than US created white papers and what have you, you're probably more familiar, as am I, more familiar with poverty guidelines. Now, these are issued by the Department of Health and Human Services, and it simplifies all of the statistical, quantitative, wildness of poverty thresholds so that we can use it for more administrative purposes, such as determining financial eligibility for different programs like TANF or SNAP or other benefits and social service welfare programs that you might know. So the poverty guidelines is kind of the rough puff pastry, if you will, compared to the actual more elaborate dough, for those of you who are also watching the Great British Bake Off on repeat this week. So sometimes we loosely define the poverty guidelines as what is known as the federal poverty level, which I have in a screen for you here on the left-hand side. This data is re-released January 15th every year, so the US Census kind of shares that with us to account for things like inflation, cost of living changes. And you can see that a minimum wage job, which is still across the country, typically $7.25 an hour, will give one person an annual salary of a little over $15,000. So if you are a household of two, you would be at the poverty level if your combined or household income was 20K. And you can see throughout that, if you're a household of eight folks, whether that's eight adults or eight children, it would be 52K. And so you can kind of see whether it's you yourself or clients or folks in your community, what the poverty level is. One thing, and I'm going to give a little spoiler for something I'll say in later slides, you can see that the poverty level is very low in terms of income. You can imagine that it is very hard to survive, let alone thrive on this level of wages. But even if you make, let's say, 16K a year, you technically wouldn't be at poverty level, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are doing well off. So the federal poverty level is kind of a baseline metric that's used to understand other levels of income. But I want to emphasize that when we think about how we colloquially use the word poor, we're not exclusively talking about folks who make exactly $15,060. We're including folks who make more than that, but still cannot afford a lot of basic necessities in life. When it comes to poverty rates, it was after the pandemic, to probably no one's surprise, that the US rise in poverty rates was pretty exponential. It was at the highest it's been since the Great Recession. The pandemic itself pushed an additional 3.9 million Americans into poverty, so actively being at that poverty level. So that 3.9 million doesn't count folks, again, who may make $16,000 a year or $20,000 a year and still need social welfare support services. When it comes to more of the statistical numbers, in 2021, the US poverty rate increased from 8.5% to 11%. We've seen it kind of dip a little bit, but then rise a little bit in more recent years. And actually, Illinois has seen the largest increase out of all the states, a rise of 33.75% between 2020 and 2021. So this is some more recent data and some a little bit more recent historical data where we're kind of seeing the cost of living increase, but also the poverty level increase. And again, I want to emphasize that 33% whose income fell to the poverty level, that doesn't include those who fell within what we would socially consider poverty, even if it's not governmentally coded as poverty. So that statistic is very murky depending on who you ask. A lot of data is self-reported, and you can imagine whether it was a survey you filled out or a man on the street interview, so to speak. If someone came up to you and said, "What's your income?" Would you say the truth? Would you say anything at all? Because poverty is something that we morally code and brings with it, excuse me, a lot of shame and a lot of really hard feelings. So the child poverty rate increased more than 2 times from 5.2% to 12.4%, again, after the pandemic. In fact, the year after things sort of opened up again. So we're seeing it wasn't just a blip of 2020 to 21 that the poverty rate increased. We've seen it consistently increase since then, a little bit less so in recent years, but anecdotally, at least from the level of usage of welfare programs locally, we're seeing an increase as well. There is a myth that, and this was used in a number of presidential campaigns on both sides of the political aisle, that minimum wage jobs are just teenagers looking to flip a burger and make some pocket money. What we don't often hear is that over half of folks who make the federal wage minimum are over 25 years old, many of whom are also supporting entire families or trying to support families making that $7 and change an hour. When it comes to governmental solutions or repair efforts for poverty, it's known that Social Security is the most important anti-poverty program and has since 2022 moved 28.9 million people out of poverty. So there are some governmental programs currently at the time of this recording that do seek to alleviate poverty for some. Poverty isn't experienced equally across different racial and ethnic groups. In fact, we see that it is Indigenous Americans, American Indians, or Alaskan Natives that are the most likely to live below the poverty line, coming in at 21%, and just right after them is the Black community, again, 21% of whom live below the poverty line. We can see the stats there on the right-hand side of your screen. It is white folks who are least likely to experience poverty in the United States for a number of reasons that we'll cover. I wanted to show some of the data because we're going to talk a little bit later about some stereotypes around race and poverty, many of which you can see come from the data, but a lot of which just come from racism. And so I'm sure you'll be able to pick out the difference between those as we move forward. A lot of conversations on poverty, whether that is some of the more hoity-toity academic research articles, some think pieces, some white papers, or just public opinion, blame inflation for the increase in poverty and the increase in financial struggle in the United States. A lot, depending on who you ask, there's a lot of different reasons for inflation. One of which is the ratio of job vacancies to unemployment, meaning that there are more open jobs than there are folks looking to seek to fill those jobs. But one of the consistent threads that I saw in my research was corporate profits, as you can see from the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You'll recall during the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion of like the pipeline in terms of goods and services. Is it stalled? Can we get trade internationally? Are the ports closed? Are they open? So it was really hard for folks to acquire goods, and that's why we saw price spikes in things like toilet paper, as you may fondly or not so fondly recall. But since then, inflation has continued to grow, even though trade has opened up. But we see that the corporate profits rose from 11% to 53%. And that labor costs used to be the bulk of where the profit margins went for consumer goods, and that's the bulk of where consumers felt the pain in their purse, so to speak. But that has shifted almost directly to being corporate profits that add to the price of consumer goods, whether that's eggs costing upwards of $8 on the West Coast. I don't know what eggs cost now, as I don't eat eggs, but you can see that it's corporate profits that are taking that more so than labor costs, which was the previous model. And we know this because federal minimum wage hasn't really increased, nor have other wages. And we know that happens at universities, we know that happens in nonprofits, but it also happens in more corporate settings too. And then to your right-hand side of the screen, you can see that inflation is at an overall 40-year high. So for those of you who are maybe feeling, I myself looked through my bank statements this morning, kind of working on my budgeting before work started, and was like, where's all this money going? Realizing it was entirely groceries. As somebody who eats a decent amount of food, but not an exponential amount of food, noticing those expenses increasing and seeing why that happens. One of the effects of inflation, and again, all of the ratio I mentioned before and kind of everything that I've shared thus far, is that we're having a shrinking of the middle class. I encourage you to just Google that and you'll see a number of self-contradictory think pieces. Folks got a lot of opinions on the middle class, and so I waded through some of those to share that the middle class is technically defined as having a household income between 53K and 161K. So at least 3 times that of the poverty level. So majority of Americans used to, in fact, be in the middle class, but we see that that is shifting a little bit with folks kind of falling more into the category of low income. It used to be that in the 70s, the amount of income that folks had in the middle class was 62%. So 62% of the US GDP, US money was in middle income homes. But as you can see here, that is less than half now. Less than half now, or almost half now, it's at 42%. So this is kind of the difference in terms of income that folks are having. And then when it comes to high income folks, the folks who are in the upper echelons of the different tax brackets, they used to hold in the 70s 29% of US wealth, and now they hold 50% of US wealth. So there's still money going around, but it's finding itself more concentrated in high income households. So that's, again, another reason that we're getting a sense of folks who historically would not be financially struggling in a job are feeling the financial pressure that they would never have done in the 70s. Again, is that inflation? Is it cost of living? Is it everything I mentioned before? Yes, but a lot of it comes from those corporate profits. I mentioned a little bit earlier the difference between poverty and being poor. I cannot stress enough, and this was something when it came to defining poverty. I found myself sort of grumpy at like people are only poor if they only make 15K a year, like 18K a year is not that much more different. That still counts as ostensibly poor. But it's important that we know being defined as poor and then living within poverty are kind of different in terms of the lived experience, because being even marginally above the poverty line or even making twice as much money as the poverty line still brings with it financial struggles in terms of affording things. So you can see here, MIT has a fantastic living wage calculator. If you have followed any sort of union action for different corporations, I know Starbucks is one that has been going through this. If you have followed any sort of particularly Gen Z millennial conversation in terms of basic income, you'll know that there's a difference between the minimum wage, what is called a poverty wage, and then what is called a living wage. So if you are a single adult here, the idea is that the minimum wage, for example, in Chicago and Illinois is $14. The minimum wage as coded by the US government is actually called oftentimes, particularly by advocates for economic justice, it's often called a poverty wage, because making only $7.24 an hour, for example, will not does not allow you to save up to move class brackets, which is, a once oft mentioned part of the American dream that is sadly not realized. And then there's arguments from MIT researchers and from other folks who do research and who live life that a living wage would actually need to be closer to $20. And so you can think about your own home, perhaps the homes of clients, maybe a two like a double income household with three kids, you would see that that living wage would need to be closer to $40 per person in order to be able to survive and get not just the basic amenities, but things like a meal out every now and then. So I encourage you to look through what the difference is between poverty wages, minimum wages, and living wages, because we don't often talk about money in terms of that. Particularly for those of you who, like me, work in nonprofit spaces, I want to acknowledge, following the end of last year, I did a session on financial trauma, acknowledging that this conversation can be really emotional for some, can bring up a lot of feelings of shame, and can bring up a lot of feelings of guilt, particularly for folks who work in nonprofit spaces, social services spaces, who aren't struggling, but feel that there's this almost universally accepted ethos that we should be struggling because we're doing mission-based work. Money is messy is really the headline in terms of not just how we spend it, but how we feel about our ability to spend or to not spend. When it comes to financial well-being, the US Federal Reserve did a very interesting study just last year, where it discovered that 72% of Americans reported doing okay financially. And so self-reported data is oftentimes researchers think it's less accurate than being observed, but I kind of disagree with that, because who knows yourself better than yourself? 19% of folks reported that they were getting by, and 9% of surveyed Americans reported that they were struggling financially. One statistic that stood out to me in terms of the general American population is that 37% of folks said that they could not cover a surprise $400 expense without using credit. And so when I talk about poverty, I am including folks who do have credit cards and typically have credit card debt, because as you can see from the right-hand side of your screen, the people's debt has been increasing as the cost of living has been increasing, but as wages have not been increasing. When it comes to debt, 77% of American households have some, whether that's homeowners debt, student debt, credit card debt. Medical debt is huge, particularly among seniors. And the average American adult has about $66,000 in debt, which, as you know from previous slides, is over triple, almost 4 times the minimum wage annual salary. So if I worked minimum wage, or what is known as a poverty wage, I could work for 4 years, not spend a single penny somehow, and only then, after 4 years, could I have close to the amount of money to cover my debt. And so thinking about how debt almost balloons into monopoly money kind of concept compared to the money that folks actually see on a weekly or monthly basis. I wanted to provide a visual in terms of poverty rates by state. So I've talked a lot about the numbers, and you might be like, okay, Hannah, that kind of sucks. I get it. Minimum wage, poverty wage. Like, I wish people made more. What else? What about it? There are direct correlations, that causation between living in poverty and really heavy physical and mental health consequences. So this is the poverty rates throughout the United States. This is from, I believe, a website called Data Pandas, but they took their information from the US Census. But I want to give credit to the folks who made the graphic, pandas that they may be, big on sharing sources. You can see that in states like Louisiana and Mississippi, 19%, so almost 1 in 5 folks live at the poverty level, meaning make 15K a year. You can imagine that more people than that, if not double that, if we think about double the poverty level, are living in a state of financial stress or, paycheck to paycheck. Because again, the poverty level does not cover all instances of being financially or economically disadvantaged. You can see in other states, the poverty level sort of is different. In Illinois, 12% of our population lives at the poverty level or below. So we're doing kind of okay compared to other states, but particularly in the South and then New Mexico, we're seeing higher levels of the population financially struggling. When we think about the health implications of that, this map to me was very, very scary. Again, using US Census data, a beautiful graphic made by an interesting site that I enjoy. You can almost directly overlap high instances of poverty. Like if you're, I'm pointing at my screen as though you can see my finger. As you think about states like New Mexico, if you think about Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, West Virginia, Kentucky, these are states with lower life expectancy than others. And so, could it be a number of different things that add into it? Absolutely. It's not just a one data point means all of this happens, but it's a significant part of why there's lower life expectancy when we think about the consequences of not being able to afford healthcare. The sort of jobs that pay 725, 750 an hour being oftentimes more physically grueling than standard white collar work. In states that have lower levels of poverty, we're seeing a higher life expectancy for about 8 years. So you can pretty much expect to live 8 years fewer than appear in California if you happen to live in Mississippi. And so that to me was very striking about the real life and death consequences of poverty. Children really sadly make up the largest age group of folks experiencing poverty. A lot of that is because, heads of households, whether it's one person or two folks, often have more kids than one or two, across like demographics, of course. And childhood poverty is associated with a lot of really negative health consequences that follow that child throughout their life. If you work in any kind of social work setting, you've heard of ACEs or a child's ACEs score, so adverse childhood experience score. So things like relationship abuse with the parents, poverty, going hungry, being made fun of for not having the coolest clothes, all of those things can lead to developmental and physical delays or illnesses for children. And not least of which are things like nutritional deficits, because as we know, it is cheaper to buy a hamburger than it is to buy a kiwi, for example. I often think about, for those of you who know Gwyneth Paltrow, Empress of Goop, I think about when Gwyneth Paltrow tried to do the minimum wage food challenge. So she tried to get enough food to live for a week, spending only what the standard SNAP food stamp recipient got. And so I admit I very wrongly made a little bit of fun of her because she bought things like lemons and limes and avocados. And I felt myself go to a place of judgment of like, come on, Goop, you really think that on like $30 a week, $20 a week, you can afford a lime and a mango or whatever else it was that she bought? Because there is this societal understanding that food benefits, that SNAP benefits, should really go for things like your hamburger helpers and like more calorie dense foods so that children have the energy to get through the day. We've made food classist, where even I fell into the trope of making fun of a woman for daring to want fruit as part of her diet simply because she was trying to do so economically, rather under the economic constraints that so many Americans have to deal with, particularly those who are raising kids who do eat nutrient-rich foods. And so I own up to my own mistake in that, and that's something that I still chastise myself for because I have become so acclimated to the way that we talk about food and financial benefits and what poor people deserve. And I use that in air quotes for those of you who may not be able to see me because it's deeply, deeply problematic and something and messaging that we all hear, right? For grown-ups who experience poverty, for children who experience poverty, they're more likely than other kiddos to experience poverty into adulthood. Again, class mobility has kind of stagnated in the United States, except for folks finding themselves making less income or dropping to becoming quote unquote lower class. Folks in poverty face adverse health effects, everything from obesity, substance use, chronic stress. And I want to emphasize that substance use doesn't come from a place of judgment, but comes from a place of like needing something to get through the day. So that's why we see some higher instances of that hurting folks. Again, substances are used and misused by elite and wealthy folks too, but they often have less damaging health consequences because of healthcare access and less stigma. So there's less stigma in general to the Wall Street banker bro doing cocaine versus somebody who may be unhoused, smoking weed or using another substance. When it comes to different genders of folks experiencing poverty, the last slide, unfortunately, where is it? This one right here about life expectancy focused on men. When it comes to women experiencing poverty versus women not at the poverty level, the top 1% income women can expect to live up to 14 and a half years longer than women who live below the poverty line. So over a decade more life. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, I won't read through everything, but we see the importance of education as a way to break free from poverty or to get out of living below the poverty line. I believe that wholeheartedly as somebody who loves education, but it's often used kind of as a like just go to school, individualism, you'll make it through, and we don't address a lot of the systemic ways that we can combat poverty, which I will get into as we go to one of our closing slides. Part of why we shame folks for living at or below the poverty level is because of media representations of poverty and kind of the ethos of the American dream of going out west, of like settling land that didn't belong to you. We know where I'm going with this. It becomes almost a moral thing to have wealth. It's often represented through what is known as the greed narrative. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation did a phenomenal study of literature, radio station programming, media, whether that was film or television, and found that the typical way an American viewer understands poverty, regardless of whether that viewer themselves lives below the poverty level or is affluent, is through two different narratives. I was a film major, so this is my thing. I love this. We typically see either the greed narrative, which codes those in poverty as selfish, dishonest, looking for handouts, gaming the system, committing fraud, all these horrible things. Or we see the character narrative, which endorses common biases like dishonesty, dirtiness, lack of intelligence, being a drain on society, all those different stereotypes that we hear about more often than not folks living in Appalachia and folks living in the South. There is a horrible, 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 yet accepted trend for particularly academic elites to adopt a sort of Southern persona or an Appalachian persona when they want to deride folks who are poor or folks who are uneducated. So socially, it's become and has remained rather acceptable to immediately code poor folks as being ignorant, uneducated, slovenly, and all of these different negative traits that are character judgments. And on top of that, the greed narrative, we're not socially seeing images of greedy fat cat billionaires, but we're seeing images of greedy poor folks robbing other poor folks, robbing the government, doing all of these horrible things. It's very, very anti-Robin Hood narrative in terms of how we are socialized to see it. For those of you who've heard the phrase, the lift yourself up by your bootstraps, it started out as an ironic phrase. However, authors like Horatio Alger created stories of like the American dream. We can think about more recent examples like Little House on the Prairie of individuals overcoming the odds and being heroes. Their closeness to wealth or closeness to well-being, again, being moral. We hear about things like the Protestant work ethic, where being affluent or being financially comfortable come with moral judgments. Therefore, if you're not succeeding, something must be wrong with you, instead of us challenging, well, you work two jobs, that's buku hours, you are only making $7 and change an hour. Maybe that's the issue versus individual character failings. But that would make less interesting TV, right? When I Googled poverty, I did a Google image search. You can see here that I have to fact check myself. Every single image is a person of color. So whether it's the algorithm, whether it's the way that we see poverty portrayed on the media, we kind of have been brought up, if you were brought up in US media, to see it as a problem for Black folks and other people of color. The majority of these images are about global poverty. You can see it's countries that are in the formerly colonized world, I will call it, or the developing world. We don't talk about it as an issue that is close to home. Yes, in the chat, I'm seeing many are pictures of India. Absolutely, you are spot on. We see it as a problem that happens over there to folks who are less deserving than us Americans over here. That is deeply problematic, deeply, deeply racist. I want to go to the next slide. Those images are really, really popularized. In fact, I'm seeing in the chat, yes, we're seeing pictures of Dharavi, one of the largest slums in India. So that's kind of the quintessential image of poverty, even though the majority of us on this call have no exposure to being in India. The majority of Americans have not been there, but that's kind of the image we hold of poverty. When it comes to representations closer to home, poverty has kind of been represented as a Black issue. So since the late 1960s, and I went on such a fun research journey for this, you can see that the percentage of Black folks who live below the poverty line was kind of down here between 20 and 30% consistently. But when you look at media representations of Black folks in poverty, whether that's in magazines, particularly in this case, you can see that even though, let's pick 1972, even though the true percentage of Black folks living below the poverty line was 30%, up to almost 80% of representations of Black folks in newspapers and magazines showed Black folks in poverty. So think about that. The majority of representations of Black folks in magazines and newspapers showed them living below the poverty level. So it's this socially constructed truth. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, Black folks are more likely to experience poverty than white folks for a number of systemic issues. We see that stereotype blown out of the water. And for those of you who are looking at the graphic a little bit closely, you'll see that a lot of this happened within the mid 60s, which was the era of civil rights. And so one can put two and two together to figure out, okay, Black folks are getting civil rights. We don't like this. We need to keep them down. And so folks in the power that be racialized poverty and sort of kept these negative depictions of Black folks in particular and other people of color. I don't want to leave out white folks, of course. When it comes to representations of white people in poverty, those are also exaggerated, oftentimes for comedic effect. Can anyone, whether in the chat or viewing this at home, recognize the gentleman at the bottom of the screen while I take a little sip of water? I picked an older picture, so that's probably unfair. But if you have lived through daytime TV in the late 90s and early aughts, you may be familiar with the one and only Jerry Springer, whose TV show, I believe he has a documentary. Yes, Kayla, thank you. He's in a current documentary that's Ready, Set, Fight, I believe is the title of it, because of his penchant for filming lower income Black and white folks fighting each other, sort of gladiatorial style, a lot of jokes about parenthood of children, a lot of stereotypes about welfare abuse, inability to be in good relationships, a lot of mocking of vernacular slang and AAVE. And so a lot of really damning stereotypes that viewers ate up with a spoon because it was entertaining, for lack of a better word. So we are seeing, again, that constant moralizing of poverty. So if you were poor, you're probably going to end up on Jerry Springer, more likely than you're going to end up in the White House or in any other position of leadership. I want to go back for a little second. So we see here that representation of overrepresentation of Black folks in poverty happened after the Civil Rights Movement. Why there was an overrepresentation of Black folks in poverty in general happens at a higher level than those damning images that you see on the newspapers, whether it's the 60s or today. Many of you will have heard of the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, fondly known as the GI Bill. This was the premier means by which the US government wanted to give back to soldiers who fought in World War II. It was a way for Americans to amass wealth. Again, the Great Depression was still in living memory for many. Folks just came out of a grueling, bitter war. The American government was like, thank you for your service. Here's some money. Here's a way for you to get a house. Let's support you. The GI Bill did not mention race. And because it did not mention equitable treatment for folks of different races and ethnicities, localized discrimination was absolutely rampant. That meant it was on individual discretion, state level, and then county discretion for how those GI Bill funds were disseminated. And exponentially, the million Black veterans who returned or whose families of deceased veterans went to seek funding from the GI Bill were not given help at all. So it was just absolutely systemically endorsed racism for that. And as we think about, I'm filming this on January 22nd, recent efforts to remove language about race from other governmental policies, we see how we are potentially at risk of things like this happening again, because there is no guarantee or no effort or no naming of a need for racial equality. And what that results to, if we think about the cost of today's dollar versus 1944 currency, each Black veteran who should have been honored by the GI Bill is still owed about $180,000. And if we think about putting $180,000 to use for each veteran, whether that's dual income, single income homes, you can see how the poverty level would absolutely just be blown out of the water, because that is a ton of money, especially for those who only make $15,000 a year. You would have to work about 100 years to get to where that is, if my math is correct. Don't correct me if it's not. My math is terrible. But you can see how it still has lasting effects. So when folks say racism isn't real, that was forever ago. No, because $180,000 today or back in 1944 with the interest it would have accrued would absolutely make the middle class, if not the upper class, like thrive in terms of Black representation, which is unfortunately not the case. I want to go back to white representations of poverty, because those are deeply problematic as well. I did another Google search because I like to fact check myself. Perhaps I am, because of the work I do, my algorithm just really likes to show me offensive stuff, and I think that is true. But I do sort of, closed incognito mode search things a lot to see what the dominant discourse is on things. And I looked up people in Appalachia, and the number of stereotypes that came up were appalling. I encourage you to Google just people in Appalachia. I didn't want to show damning images because that felt like I'm creating more problems and promoting more stereotypes. But you can see that the second search was feral. The first search was blue because there was an instance of one gentleman and his family consuming colloidal silver as a home remedy for various ailments, and it turned his skin blue. He was on all of the problematic daytime TV shows, and he became kind of the mascot for poverty in Appalachia. Representations of Appalachia, whether that's the West Virginia area, kind of that part of the US where there is, again, a lower life expectancy and higher poverty rates. Code Appalachians as being ignorant, code Appalachians as being sort of backwards. A lot of the I hate this word, but like hick or hillbilly stereotypes kind of stem from there, and it's something that is still done today, even by very informed folks. So there are no more stereotype regions again than the South and Appalachia, again, which offers horrible depictions of both Black and white folks, but typically ignore the presence of Black folks. And so oftentimes, I say this again a couple days after the inauguration, even well-meaning folks who are progressive fall into these stereotypes as a sort of like moral virtue that is, again, still deeply problematic and still embedded in racism and classism and moralizing systemic flaws that leave people living in poverty. And so it's a moment for us all to kind of look in the mirror and see where we may have absorbed that or where we may have okayed that. It wouldn't be a presentation on poverty if I didn't bring up stereotypes around the welfare queen. Former President Ronald Reagan, as part of his presidential campaign, mentioned a Chicago woman who defrauded the government of hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's something about presidential candidates coming for Chicago and Illinois. I think we'll notice the theme there. Reagan, picked one woman whose name is Linda Taylor, who was a lifelong con woman, who had severe mental illness, who assumed 33 known aliases, had a little bit of a Rachel Dolezal moment and would pretend to be Latino, pretend to be Indigenous, pretend to be Black. And he took this mentally unwell woman with a very storied criminal past and turned her into the poster child of what we now know as the welfare queen. He incited a moral panic about, oh no, these scary Black folks, particularly Black women, keep having babies and are taking our state money. They're taking your money, Americans. And this is a narrative that we've seen in presidential campaigns since then. No points for guessing who. Whereas, in fact, when it comes to labor participation, Black folks work a little bit more. Higher percentage of Black folks, as reported by the US Bureau of Labor, work than white folks or Latinx folks. And we see that social assistance recipients, so folks who receive welfare, are typically white. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of things like affirmative action, which is in many cases no more, are white women. But there's this narrative that it's Black folks, even though, again, as you can see, a marginally larger percentage of Black folks work, but a significantly larger percentage of white folks receive social assistance. And so offering this data because we want to bust those myths. When it comes to debunking the myth of the welfare queen, this was from the United States Sentencing Commission fraud team. I did not think that I would ever know what that was, but I went in deep for y'all. 66% of government benefits fraud offenders were male, not female. Significant number of them were white, so 35%, compared with, again, 33% Black folks, 24% Hispanic, what have you. So marginally more white folks, significantly more men. And for those who may be hearing significant amounts of anti-immigrant rhetoric in terms of undocumented immigrants using welfare, it's not true. 90.7% of folks who committed benefits fraud were US citizens. And so we hear all these lies, we hear all these stereotypes, but none of them are true. There's the notion that women on welfare have more children to get more money. That is absolutely false. The annual birth rate for folks on welfare is actually significantly lower, or somewhat lower, I should say. No, significantly lower than that of folks who are not on welfare. So 45.8 out of every 1,000 compared to 71 out of every 1,000. So folks on welfare, folks living at the poverty level, cannot have children. They cannot afford to do so in many instances or choose not to do so. There's a myth that the majority of Americans won't use the welfare system. So part of how, as a country, we are able to make fun of people at the poverty level or be derisive about folks who do need welfare is we believe that we won't ever need it. A friend made the comment, and I'm sure she stole it from a comedian, is that a lot of Americans have the positionality of temporarily embarrassed millionaires, this notion that we would never need that help. We can be self-sufficient because of how much we sort of swim in the American dream. But we see that about 2/3 of Americans will use some level of welfare, whether that's assistance with student loans, whether that's SNAP or TANF. There's a number of different ways that we all benefit from governmental safety net, so to speak. There's the idea that welfare fraud is rampant. This was actually a presidential campaign point from Bill Clinton. So this does happen on both sides of the political aisle, where he was the candidate who promised to end welfare altogether. We see that there are only 14 out of 10,000 folks who receive SNAP committed fraud. So that is a teeny tiny percentage. And $11 out of every $10,000 paid in benefits by the US government was linked to an individual or an individual whose family member committed something fraudulent or did something fraudulent with that money. I believe globally, the percentage of welfare that is used fraudulently or taken fraudulently averages about 2.5%. When it comes to US statistics, it's between 6 to 9% of all welfare use being fraudulent, so pretty low numbers. When it comes to other stereotypes, again, the moralizing of poverty, folks would like us to believe that programming like welfare, unemployment benefits, induce laziness and even criminal behaviors. The notion of if you give them something for free, they won't work, which is completely false because more than half of folks who are on SNAP benefits are employed, and 80% of folks who use SNAP were employed either the year before they received the benefits, while they received the benefits, or after they received the benefits. So we're finding that this is the helping hand that allows people to become autonomous, have back their agency. And I believe my last myth to debunk, because of how we moralize wealth and poverty, because we sort of look up to people with wealth and think, gosh, they must be good people, there's a stereotype that people who live off of handouts, people live off of handouts because they're poor, or they're poor because they live off of handouts, excuse me. But those of us who are middle income or wealthy, like we've earned everything we ever had. But that's not necessarily true because the vast majority of welfare benefits go to the middle class. It's everything from subsidies for first-time home buyers, subsidies to farmers who have bad crops, clean energy support for as long as it lasts. There's a number of welfare programs, the vast majority of funding for which goes to middle class efforts rather than to folks living below the poverty line. And the last myth, I believe this one is the last or second last, the notion that welfare spending is, and I quote, I hate this word, but crippling the American economy. It barely holds a candle to the amount of spending that is done for defense. So there, in 2014, it's harder to get more recent statistics. There's $615 billion spent on defense and 370 spent on the totality of social welfare programs, including income tax credit, TAMP, SNAP, HUD, Section 8 housing, and other poverty relief programs. So knowing I've only got y'all for 10 more minutes, I wanted to offer some systemic solutions, and you'll pick up where I'm going with this. So a vast number of researchers, whether they were folks within the government or NGOs or third-party researchers, know that providing basic livable wages is the most straightforward way to support folks who live below the poverty level and allow them to regain autonomy, regain dignity, and be able to afford life such as it is. What has been suggested time and time again in the research is to expand, not close safety net programs, to create good paying jobs, to raise the minimum wage, to provide permanent paid family and medical leave. Oftentimes we see folks who work hourly get sick. And because there is no paid sick days, there is no understanding that life happens, they're often terminated, falling into a cycle of being unemployed, also being ill, trying to figure out how to make things work. We see that the research indicates that we need to increase worker power. So to be less beholden to organizations that put employees in warehouses where they don't even have time for bathroom breaks. We need to invest primarily in affordable, high quality childcare because childcare is infrastructure. Without childcare, you're reducing families to single income earning because one parent likely has to take care of the kids while the other earns. We need to expand access to healthcare. Well people do better work than folks who are unwell. They can do it more sustainably. We need to reform the criminal justice system to enact policies that support successful reentry. At YWCA, we have the Labyrinth House, and the reason that our recidivism rate was 0 for last year is because we do social support programming, different counseling, different guidance, mentorship, providing a safe, stable living environment that allows folks to focus on their well-being and what a job could be. We need to invest in affordable housing. If you have looked at WGLT today, you'll notice that we need thousands of units to accommodate for population growth. And then we need to modernize the Supplemental Security Insurance Program, or SSI. All of these things, time and time again, research has indicated would solve poverty, would alleviate poverty, and would allow Americans of all backgrounds to live well with dignity. I don't think I need to be too paint by numbers in terms of showing that a lot of these things are executive orders or upcoming executive orders that are being proposed to take away. And so it's interesting to find the ways that different presidential campaigns have focused solutions that are rooted in systemic wellness and systemic corrections, as are these, versus other presidential campaigns, again, at both ends of the aisle, depending on the president, of course, that focus on individual blame and cutting back welfare programs with the idea that that would boost tax revenue for citizens, whereas really these are the solutions that time and time again come up for folks. And so when it comes to how we see poverty, the Spark Notes version, for those of you who may still be chewing on some of the statistics, is we are socialized, I should say, to see it as individual failings, individual disparaging situations of blame, whereas really all of the solutions, both historically and presently, are geared towards systemically making changes that support groups of individuals. It is my hope that that is one of the takeaways, in particular when it comes to the ways that poverty is judged particularly to Black women and women of color, because we still hear the welfare queen myth being used again in Clinton's campaign, the most recent presidential campaign. Um, it's it's persistent, even though consistently the data has proven it not to be true. And so, for something that we can do, for those of you who are viewing, whether now or in the future, remember one or two of these statistics, remember one or two of these solutions, because the myths are so pervasive and so damning that folks believe them to be true. And because we believe them to be true, we continue to support systems that effectively make it close to true by continuing to economically disadvantage and disempower Black women and all folks of color. In the chat, for those of you who may not see it in the future, someone listened to the podcast Candyman, which they recommend. The movie was related to a real story in Chicago, which had to do with housing inequality, racism and policing, media tropes, etc. So that is my homework. Lastly, I wanted to offer some language advice. Let me check the time. Am I on time? I'm almost out of time. Because words are not value neutral. Try not to reduce people to social or medical conditions. Person first language is preferred. So person experiencing homelessness versus homeless person. Shift the focus from people to the systems. So things like communities impacted by welfare cuts instead of poor communities, and avoid judgmental language. So some of these earlier suggestions on the slide feel a little bit fluffy or amorphous. They're not the worst thing if you say it, but we're trying to shift language, particularly in policy, because that will help in turn shape the policy to be more systemically focused. We want to use less judgmental language, so things like stricken, suffering, the war on poverty, the war of welfare, because that implies that there is an enemy in this, when really we should be seeing each other as community members to whom we are linked and to whom we are indebted for the sake of just being people in a shared world. I encourage y'all to take a little snap of this or a screenshot of this, some alternative languages, language use that you can use and why. So folks living below the poverty level, for folks in the lowest income bracket, instead of the poor, poverty stricken, or welfare reliant, which is one of the more negative things you can say. Describing communities as under-resourced or under-supported instead of inner city or the G word, because that implies there's a bad part of town, and also the G word is deeply, deeply racialized and problematic, whereas if we frame it as under-resourced, we see that there's a disparity in terms of resources given. Instead of saying things like working poor, that is always a weird one to me. It implies that nobody also works, but is it a good thing? So just say folks working to make ends meet, or just kind of challenge it, because working poor has historically had more negative connotations than it does now. And then talking about folks who are unhoused, try not to use the word homeless, because it brings with it a lot of negative stereotypes. Again, this isn't a never say this ever again, but things to consider, as in particular in written communication for those of us who work with folks who live below the poverty line, in terms of small ways that we can reemphasize dignity and reemphasize systemic solutions. In addition to the podcast that was just shared, which I will absolutely be diving into, I wanted to offer a couple of resources, in particular the book Bootstrapped, which I very much love. Alyssa Court does a fantastic job of reviewing poverty and how it is, again, moralized. There's a couple of movies here, like the Florida Project, a couple of websites, Poverty USA, and the Coalition on Human Needs being, in my mind, first and foremost against them, from reviewing poverty from a US perspective. And then lastly, my email here, if I can be of any use, or if you just want to rage about the state of income inequality in America, that is one of my favorite things to do at all times. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Now that I can see my screen, I will stop recording if folks have any comments or questions.